Hallelujah. How you guys doing? Isn't God good to us? Real quick, we wanted to share with you some things as your pastors mentioned, and let's give them a round of applause. No higher office than the office of the shepherd, amen? And so I wrote a book called The Elephant in the Bedroom, and I wrote this, about 2 years ago, and it came out of the many counseling sessions that I had done with singles as well as married couples. There's probably, about 12 to 15 years worth of marriage counseling. And what I did was I kind of reduced it down to the biggest things that people dealt with. And I put it into a book. And so The Elephant in the Bedroom is available back there. I think it's $14.99. And then we have moved all of our CDs onto USBs. And so you can actually we just combined everything we had into groups. So everything we had on relationships, everything we have on healing, everything we have on finances are all in one little jump drive. And so most of them I think they're $29 for about 30 to 40 hours worth of teaching. And so we just try to make it real economical and easy to deal with. So help yourself to anything back there. I'm sure it'll be a blessing to you. Amen? Amen. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to start off with a hot button topic, which, of course, is sex. And one of the things that there are kind of three lies that the world has begun to tell people. And as the world has progressively gotten worse and worse in their narrative concerning sex, they have purported sex to be something that is just a physical activity. And it's interesting because they kind of make it like sex is the answer to everything. A failed relationship, the answer is sex. If you're going through a hard time, just go find somebody to hook up with, and that'll resolve all your problems. And the reality is that sex in its proper construct will enhance a relationship, but if it's used improperly, it'll destroy it. Right. And so let's go to 1 Corinthians real quick, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 16. 1 Corinthians 6, 16. I'm going to read this out of the Message Bible. You can obviously follow along with whatever translation you have. But it says, there is more to sex than mere skin on skin. Sex is as much spiritual mystery as a physical fact. As written in Scripture, the two become one. Since we want to become spiritually one with the Master, we must not pursue the kind of sex that avoids commitment and intimacy, leaving us more lonely than ever. The kind of sex that can never become one. There is a sense in which sexual sins are different from all others. In sexual sin, we violate the sacredness of our own bodies. These bodies that were made for God-given and God-modeled love, for becoming one with another. Or didn't you realize that your body is a sacred place, the place squandering what God paid such a high price for, or a place for the Holy Spirit? Don't you see that you can't live however you please, squandering what God paid such a high price for? The physical part of you is not some piece of property belonging to the spiritual part of you. God owns the whole works. So let people see God in and through your body. See, the reality is there is no condom big enough for your soul. And people don't understand when it comes to relationships, and I'm talking to the singles, I'm talking to those that are married. It is important for us to understand these things. If you're single, this is going to help you for your future. If you are married, then this is things that you need to learn within your own relationship as well, as we have lost the day and age of the older ones teaching the younger ones. It's one thing to teach people how to knit a blanket. It's another thing to teach them how to act under one. Yeah. And so there are things that we need to make sure that as the church, we are responsible to correct wrong thinking and to teach people what needs to be taught. And when we deal with kids, I just had a session not too long ago And the lady said, she said, my kid is 9 years old, and she doesn't understand any of this stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, you're wrong. Your kid understands a lot more than you think they do, because they're having conversations that they should not have. And I don't want the world teaching my kids what things should and should not be, because the world has its own agenda and it has its own narrative, and that's not what should be happening. We as the church should be involved with literally teaching people this is the way God intended and this is what God desires. And so the first lie is that sex is just a physical activity. The second one is that I can do what I want and have what God wants. We have unfortunately garnered a generation of people who believe that you do not have to forsake the world in order to serve God. And the reality is you do have to forsake all things in the world in order to serve God. And then the third thing is, I've already messed up, so there's no hope for me. And the truth of the matter is that all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory. And we have to understand that we've got to get it back together, put it back in its proper context, and go on to do the things that God has called us to do, the way God has called us to do it. And so the first thing we need to understand, there's 7 keys to sexual fulfillment. And the 7 keys, first one is sex is God designed. It's God-given, therefore it should be God-governed. There is a prevailing thought in the church that sex is dirty. I know that I was an altar boy in the Episcopal Church, which is like 2 shades different from Catholic. And everything related to sex was dirty. It was never to be discussed. And there was a prevailing idea that you can't be spiritual and sexual at the same time. And here's the challenge. If sex is God-designed, which we know that it is, and it's God-given, then it ought to be God-governed. And the reality is that sex is, in fact, a thermometer and a thermostat of a relationship. A thermometer tells you the temperature in a room. A thermostat sets the temperature in the room. And sex does both things in a relationship. And so I want you to understand I'm talking about covenant relationship. I'm talking about in the institution of marriage. And so there's in a lot of the mining facilities, they used to use canaries. And the canary was down in the mines with the workers. And if that canary passed out and died, it meant you got to get out of there. Yeah. It was the signal that there's a problem. Sex is the canary in the mine. When we become so busy, we become harboring unresolved angers and issues. Unfortunately, when we get busy and the kids are running us from one event to the next event and to the next thing and to the next thing, sex becomes one of those things that we don't think is important, really, until it's too late. And so we have to be very careful how we see these things and how we gauge sex within our marriage, because how many of you know Christians should have the healthiest marriages on the planet? Yeah. When people look at us, they should see the model of what sex is supposed to be. And so the deception and the images in society, we have to be very careful, because here's one of the challenges. Pornography represents women as not having emotions and purely as objects. And so when men struggle in that area, they tend to lose sight of the fact that when I married someone, I married all of them. I didn't marry a piece of them, I married all of them. And you're going to find that I'm going to hit men and women pretty equally here. The problem, ladies, with you guys is these soap operas and these romance novels have painted men as if they are emotional women with different plumbing. And so now you're looking for this guy who's sensitive, and the reality is that, yes, men should be understanding of emotions, they should be sensitive to emotions, but he should not be a male form of you. Because when all proverbial hell has broken loose, you want somebody who's going to be able to stand up and handle things like he's supposed to handle them. And so when you have these representations of media that now script our lives in such a way that's got men looking for something that doesn't exist and women looking for something that doesn't exist, now you have a very serious problem, because now you're trying to figure out how to make this all work. And so if you notice, When it comes to pornography, most of those are made by men. And when you look at these Harlequin and I think that's right, Harlequin or something, these romance novels, most of them are written by women. And they're painting men as effeminate. And so there's some challenges here in being able to understand each other as we relate to each other, because if you don't understand your partner, you will begin to look for things in your partner that does not exist or cannot be found. And you will become dissatisfied, not because this dissatisfaction is warranted, but because you are looking for something that does not exist. And that's what the world wants us to do, is to continue to seek after something that we don't have. Are you here? And so the relationship between challenges of how God sees sex, I want you to see something here. Genesis 2:24. Genesis 2:24. It says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be" what? One flesh. Would it surprise you to know that word cleave means sexual intimacy? And it says that a man is supposed to leave his mother and father, and he is to be intimate with his wife. Here's the interesting part about that. From the very beginning, God set that as a priority. And so many people don't think it's necessary. They don't think it's, they struggle with the idea, well, that good Christians aren't sexual people. And good Christians are sexual people, but they understand the confines or the context by which sex is supposed to be utilized. And I'm telling you, we have got to learn to teach our kids these things and stop acting like it's a taboo subject and give them the proper context in which it functions in, so that they desire after godly relationships instead of trying to just ignore it and act like we're not going to talk about it because, well, it's just taboo. Because I guarantee you, if you won't talk to them, somebody will. And the problem is, you don't want that person to begin to discuss it with them in the backseat of a car. Are y'all understanding what I'm saying? Yeah. And so we have to recognize that if he told us to be fruitful and multiply, then he had a desire in his heart as to what this context would be. And more importantly, if we're going to be fruitful and multiply, why would God give us a desire and then frustrate the desire? See, this is one of the challenges, I believe, that certain types of denominations have, where they have priests who have took a vow of celibacy and so on and so forth. Let's think about this for a second. Yeah. If they really had the gift of celibacy, they wouldn't want anything or anyone. Are you here? Yes. And so the challenges that have faced different denominations have been because they don't have the gift of celibacy. Some people do and some people don't. But if you try to put somebody in a situation that cannot control that, that's why Paul said it's better to marry than burn. But you can't force yourself down that road. I've seen people say, well, I don't want a husband, I don't want a wife. Well, listen, if you have the gift of celibacy, Paul said, go ahead and do that. But if you don't, then you need to get married and put it in its proper context so that it doesn't burn you later. And so look at Hebrews 13, verse 4. Hebrews 13, verse 4. It says, marriage is honorable in all, the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Notice something here. Marriage is honorable what? In all, and the bed is undefiled. But whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. And it almost seems like he's shifting the conversation. He says, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. But the conversation doesn't shift. Right. What he is literally saying, the only time that God condemns sex is when it's outside of the marriage. That's why I said whoremongers and adulterers, God will judge, but marriage is to be held in honor. And then he says, let your conversation be without covetousness. In other words, let what you do not desire things that are outside of the marriage covenant. And he likens this relationship to himself. That's why he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. See, what people don't understand is what God was telling them was, if you're going to come after me, then treat it like you would treat your marriage. Amen. And treat your marriage like you would treat me. You don't go after other gods. You don't go after other women. You don't go after other men. You find what you need within the confines of what you have. So then that means as people, we have to recognize that we are responsible as a husband to my wife, as a wife to your husband. You are responsible to create an atmosphere where they are able to find whatever it is they need in the confines of you. So that they never have to go outside of it. That's why I said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. See, he's explaining covenant, and he's saying, don't be covetousness, because covetousness is to desire something that doesn't belong to you. You cannot covet what you already have. And he's saying that in the covenant between you and your spouse, you are to desire what that person brings to you, because it is their responsibility to meet those needs. The word Eden means pleasures and delights. God created sex for procreation and for pleasure. There's nothing wrong with it. And we got to stop acting like it's such a taboo. It's not. In its right context, there is nothing taboo about it. We have got to learn that fear is not the way to lead people. Right. It's to educate and to give them the information they need to make good decisions. Amen. The second key to sexual fulfillment is there is a sexual difference between men and women. There's a sexual difference between men and women. It's young men, they hit puberty, and things start growing and changing and happening, and they're just enamored because they're like, hey, what is this going on down here? And then they move into their hormones start raging, and in their 20s, men want to swing from the chandeliers, and they just, they're full of vim and vigor, and in their 20s, women would just want to be held. And so then you go to later on in years, it switches. So 25 years later, they hit the 40s and 50s, and then the men want to be held, and the women want to swing from the chandeliers. Now, I'm not exactly sure why God designed it that way, but I can tell you that's exactly the way it is. And so when you understand there's a difference between men and women, you begin to see that there is certain things that don't match each other. In other words, what you like as a female is not the same as a male. Male requires sexual touching. Women require non-sexual touching. And so when you deal with how they arrive even at climaxes, they arrive there differently. Men can really be ready in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Because men are like microwaves, women are like crock pots. And so, you have to learn that men, they get there real fast. And fellas, we have to understand that she doesn't. And if you are not going to make love to her all day long by sending messages, baby, I'm thinking about you. There's some things I want to do when I get home. I've been thinking about you. Amen. See, you have to stoke the flames and understand that these are the ways that people are different. If you begin to see how everybody goes through these different phases and different understandings, you cannot be selfish. Listen. A man goes through a cycle, and a woman goes through a cycle, right? A woman's cycle is every, 28 days, roughly. Yes? Mm-hmm. What's a man's cycle? 28 minutes. 15 and a cup of juice. Now, here's what I want you to understand. If a man's cycle is so fast, stop acting like he has a demon because he wants you. Because I've seen wives, they deal with their husband like, oh, he has a demon. Something wrong with him. We got to cast that demon out of him. No, he does not have a demon. He's looking to be a seed. He's a seed bearer. He's looking for his wife as his direction for his affection. Well, he just wants it 3-4 times a day. Didn't give it to him 3 or 4 times a day, and watch what happens to everybody's attitude. But the realities are that he is different. There is no demon. We're not going to lay hands on him because he is different. He's built different. Are you understand what I'm saying? And then as men, you got to understand that if you do want it in that way, then you better learn to deal with her through her emotions and not just through sex. Because there's so many other things that are necessary. And men, if you are selfish, you're going to come at her the wrong way with the wrong intentions, and it's not going to work out well for either one of y'all. Because once again, y'all are different. And so men are stimulated by what they see. Men are very, very visual. Why do you think worldly men end up in strip clubs? To see things that they can't have. Wave a $100 bill in front of your own wife and see what will happen. And see what really jumps off. I'm serious. But see, why do you think they do that? Listen, here's why. Because when they come home, yeah, we okay, y'all? Because when he comes home and she's in, her sweatpants or her moo-moo outfit, and she's like, I'm just trying to be comfortable. I just want to be comfortable. Hair's all, in a bun, disheveled, messy bun. Listen, y'all, I don't know what this issue is with this messy bun stuff, but in the name messy tells you, but I'm going to leave that alone because I'm not trying to get thrown out on the first day. But listen to me. If men are very visual, right, you have to think about something. Because as women, you are so critical of your own bodies that you cover it up. You know how you do? You try to get in bed, right? So you hit the light switch and you're in bed before the room gets dark. And now your husband is stymied because he wants to see you. And you're like, well, but you don't understand. I've had kids and I got this place and this place and this has moved to this place and this fell to this spot. He doesn't care. Because every imperfection you see is a roadmap of his life that he spent with you. And so it does not bother him the way it bothers you. You have an issue with it. He does not. He wants to see all of that. He wants the lights on to see what's going on because he's a visual person. And when you don't give him what he wants to see, $10 and Amazon goes a long way when it comes to some lingerie. It's not expensive. But give him something to anticipate. Give him something to look at. He needs to see those things because that's how he functions. And then, fellas, ladies are stimulated by what they feel. So if now you're going, oh, does that mean I have conversations? Yes. That's exactly what it means. Because what begins to happen is they're going from kids to chef to homemaker to working in the business, and then all of a sudden you want her to be a sex goddess. And all the ladies said, she needs to be reminded through it all, periodically throughout the day, that she is, whoa, man. Because that's what Adam said when he saw Eve. He's like, whoa, man. And that's how y'all got woman. So she has to know that she is that place in your heart, in your mind, and in your desire. She needs to know that. Amen. And if you think, well, she knows I come home, don't I? Listen, the dog comes home. That doesn't send any signals. But men, we have to understand, because we don't want to talk about a thing. We just think everybody should know what. No, that does not work. You've got to minister to her emotions and the way she feels, because her sexuality comes out of that area. And so if you want to be successful, you got to realize that you are going to have to let her know you bear her burdens, and ladies, you're going to have to let him know that you bear his burdens. People need to understand timing. They need to understand scheduling. I've never seen anything like this in my life because it makes no sense. Think about this for a minute. Let me just throw this out here, and we'll see where we go with it. Think about this. People in relationships, husband and wives, they act like planning sex is so inconvenient. There's no spontaneity. But they plan affairs. There's no spontaneity in an affair. There's got to be some orchestration going on there. But yet we don't want to orchestrate within our own, talking about, well, it's just not spontaneous enough. No, there needs to be times and dates set. There need to be things where, the kids might have to go to grandma and grandpa's house. The kids might got to go somewhere else. Something has to happen. Things have got to be put on a schedule. It's got to be made a priority, because when it's a priority, planning and scheduling is not the enemy of passion. Because people need rest, they need time, they need to understand the family demands. There are so many things that need to be dealt with, and when you handle it properly, there's a certain excitement that happens because it's coming. And so now you get to treat your relationship as if it was an affair. You may need to meet somewhere at a hotel in the middle of the day with your wife. Yeah, sometimes you got to do that. People hear stuff, boy, and they just take a piece of it. Watch what Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 8. The Song of Solomon, the 4th chapter, the 8th verse. Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse, with me from Lebanon. Look from the top of Amana, and from the top of Shinir, Hermon, and from the lion's den to the mountains of leopards. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with thine eyes, and with one chain of thy neck. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse? How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thine ointments than all spices? Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue, and the smell of thy garments is like the smell of Lebanon. Verse 12. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, my spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Thy plants are an orchard of pomegranates and pleasant fruits, camphor and spikenard and saffron and calamus and cinnamon and all trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes, with all the chief spices, a fountain of gardens, a well of living waters and streams from Lebanon. Awake, O north wind, and come, thou south. Blow upon my garden, thy spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. Chapter 5, verse 1. I am come into my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice, and I have eaten my honeycomb with my honeycomb. I have drunk my wine with my milk, and eat, O friends, drink. Drink abundantly, O beloved. I sleep, but my heart waketh. It is the voice of my beloved that knocketh, saying, Open unto me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. For my head is filled with dew, and my locks drip with the sweat of night. Isn't that something? I have put off my coat. How shall I put it on? I have washed my feet. How shall I defile them? My beloved put in his hand by the hole of the door. My bowels were moved for him. I rose up to open to my beloved. My hands dropped with myrrh, and my fingers, a sweet-smelling myrrh, upon the handles of the lock. Isn't it something how this is all talking about opening up to each other and enjoying the passion of each other? And one of the key things I want you to see here is in verse 2, he says, Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, and my undefiled. He says my sister, not because of sister relationship, because sometimes I think we miss translation because English doesn't always translate correctly what is being conveyed in the Hebrew. And so when he's saying my sister, he's saying my equal, my equally yoked, it's a sign of respect that she's not beneath him, but she's equal in yoking to him. She's just like him, just different. And then he says, my love, which means this is my choice. I love you because it's my choice to love you. And I want you to understand that in today's day and age, people will have what they call irreconcilable differences. Oh, we just fell out of love. You don't fall out of love. Love is the fruit of commitment. Commitment is not the fruit of love. So you don't love somebody or you don't be committed to somebody because you love them. You love them because you're committed to them. Amen. And so then he calls her my dove, which is symbolic of purity. And then he says my undefiled, which is entire devotion. And so listen to what he's telling her, that as they are having this conversation about their intimacy and her opening herself and giving herself to him, fellows, pay attention. He's telling you the formula. He's telling you that if she is your equal and you treat her that way and you respect her that way, then she will open herself to you. If you choose to love her, not she should know that I love her, but you choose to love her and you allow your language and your communication and your romance to be a part of life, then you will see that her purity, he called her my dove, and he said is undefiled. In other words, she has entire devotion. She's not looking for anything else or anybody else. She is only looking for you. And if you are handling things properly, then you will find that she will be walking around in broad daylight with a flashlight looking for you, which is what it's supposed to be. That's the passion that a relationship should have. I mean, one of the problems that people see in the world is when they see Christians, they just assume a sexless marriage and that it's boring. It shouldn't be that way. God created it. If it was God-given, it's God-designed, then it should be God-governed. Right? Okay, so what we have to recognize is, look at 2 Corinthians 6:14. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Be not unequally yoked together with what? Unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness, with communion hath light with darkness? Now, do you remember Matthew 18 when it talks about if you go to someone in the church, one of your brothers or sisters, and they won't hear you, it says treat them like an unbeliever. Same word here. So, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is I want you to recognize something. Most people, when they read this, they think all this means is when it says to be not, or to be not to be unequally yoked with an unbeliever, all they think this means is someone who does not believe in God, as in an atheist. And this do not be unequally yoked means more than that. Because if it's talking in Matthew 18 to a believer, you can't be an atheist and be a believer at the same time. So what it is really talking about is someone who does not believe like you believe. And so when you are yoked with someone, and here's where this ties in, you got to make sure you are yoked with your bag of tricks. In other words, as people who are dating and getting to know each other and courting each other, you should have conversations about things you like and things you want to do within the confines of your marriage. You should have those conversations. Most people are afraid to talk about this stuff. But here's the problem. You can't wait until you get married and jump out the closet with a Batman outfit on. You might get shot. You need to tell her what these things are that you want to do. If you're considering marrying this person, you need to be equally yoked. And you need to be equally yoked in the area of your intimacy as well as many other things. But it's funny how people leave this part out. And then they wonder why later on when you come up to her and say, I would like to try da da da, and she thinks you got a demon. Are you? See, we have to realize that it's a push-pull when it comes to men and women. Watch this, y'all. Men become more emotional when women become more sexual. Women become more sexual when men become more emotional. It's a push-pull. And God made it that way for a reason. You don't believe me? Ask him for anything after y'all have just had sex. Most likely his answer will be, sure, baby, whatever you want. Why? Because after sex, he's opened up. And if you begin to understand this about men and you begin to understand this about women, then men, you will learn that if you want her to be more sexual, you are going to have to learn how to be. Because that draws her closer, and that's how she processes things. So chemistry comes and goes, y'all. People say, well, I just don't have any chemistry. Listen, chemistry is not as much as you think it is. Chemistry will come and go. Through the seasons of life, chemistry changes. Yes. But commitment is supposed to last forever. And so we have to learn to stop just taking clothes off of our body and take the clothes off of our hearts. Because that's the way God deals with us, and that's the way he expects us to deal with our spouses. Number 3, you must have the heart of a servant. You must have the heart of a servant. Even Jesus himself said, I came to serve. And romance is the communication of desire. Without romance, there's no communication of desire. You may have a desire, but without building in romance, there's no communication of that. And so there needs to be self-initiated pursuit. Not where she's got to nag you and tell you to do nice things for her or take her these places or go out to dinner or buy her flowers and stuff like that. That's one of the problems I have with the idea of Valentine's Day. I think it's terrible that you only have one day to express your romance. That's just commercialized money-making scheme that we've fallen into. The reality is passion is supposed to be present, and romance becomes the communication of our desire, and you should desire all the time. And you need to recognize how to be creative in that communication, because all they want to know is that they're valued and considered. And here's the problem, ladies. When men stop talking, see, you have to understand that, ladies, you use it's 60 to 80,000 words a day, and men use 6,000 words a day. It's something very drastically different between that. And what I want you to understand is men don't communicate the way women do. We use way less words. And if that's the case, I want you to understand this. When a man stops talking, there's nothing necessarily wrong. He just doesn't want to talk. When a man starts to talk about something, there's a problem. When it starts coming out of his mouth that there's an issue with something, there is a problem. Now, the opposite is true. Ladies, you guys talk anyway. So you'll talk about the problem through the problem, and it may not be that big of a deal, and you'll still talk about it. Fellas, when she stops talking about it, that's when it's really a problem. Isn't that interesting? How the two are so polar opposite in the way that they handle things. But if you don't recognize that, and you don't have the heart of a servant, you're not going to be there to serve. Because if you're there to serve, you'll recognize something about a person. See, men are like windshields. You don't really know your windshield is present in your car because you get in your car, you drive places. You would only know that windshield's not there as if that windshield was gone. Don't let it get to that place to not understand how much pressure that people can actually be under. And if you're there with the heart of a servant, then you're going to do things in the language of what your spouse likes. And there now helps you to see that there are acts of service, there are being honorable, and this goes both ways. Husbands towards their wives and wives towards their husbands. And if you come with that idea of, I'm going to be a servant, then you approach it differently. One of the things I particularly like about Chick-fil-A is when you go to ask them for something, they say, it's my pleasure. They don't say no problem. Now I want you to think about that for a second. Because a heart of a servant, when you say, oh, it's no problem, it's no big deal, it's almost what you're really saying is, it is a problem, but I chose to just ignore it. When you say it's my pleasure, that's the heart of a servant. And when a husband says to his wife, baby, it's my pleasure, then he's coming with the heart of a servant and not saying, well, because men dread these 4 words. We need to talk. That's like, as soon as a man hears, oh, God. But what if he responded and said, oh, it's my pleasure? See, it's a different heart. And I'm trying to get you to understand that when you have the spirit of a servant and you understand it is your responsibility to serve your spouse, as a man you serve your wife, as a wife you serve your husband, then you see things differently. And when he wants things from you or desires things from you, when you see it as, oh, this is my pleasure, not, oh, it's no big deal. I'll just suffer through it. I'll deal with it. That's not what it is. Right. That's the enemy of passion. Let's look at 1 Corinthians real quick, chapter 7. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto his wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto her husband. The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. This is some pretty strong language, the next sentence. He says, defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. But come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. He called it fraud. That's a federal crime. That ain't local stuff, that's federal. He called it fraud. Meaning, as wives, you owe it to your husbands, and as husbands, you owe it to your wives. It is not a privilege that if, she does good and she doesn't do this or she doesn't do that or he's a good boy, then he gets rewarded. It's owed. And to not allow that to occur is fraud. Why y'all get so quiet? And notice what God is saying here. He says, defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time. He's telling you that even if she wanted to devote herself to prayer and fasting to God, he says, I won't get in the middle of this. It better be by consent. Oh, my goodness. I have seen ministers after minister after minister, particularly those traveling, who don't. This is why God told me my family goes with me. And he told me very specifically, never make a responsibility or push on the people, on the churches you go to. He said, never even bring it up. You bring your family. That means everywhere I go, if I have to fly, it's 3 plane tickets. He said, I will take care of you, but you keep your family together. And this is what happens. People say, well, I got the call of God on me, so I'm going to have to go, and now I can't take care of you, and I can't meet your needs, and then marriages are falling apart. I've seen that happen so many times because they neglect and they put God first and say, well, the call comes first. God is telling you right here, if it ain't by consent. Now, that doesn't mean I don't travel or go do things by it, because we do. But by and large, we travel together unless it's by consent. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Yeah. And there's no way I can say, well, I'm putting God first. I'm spiritual, I'm doing this, and this is for God, and so God trumps you. Because he said right here, if it ain't by consent, even I don't come before. Do you see what I'm saying? And so he says, except it be for a time. In other words, don't force Satan into your relationship because you're not handling it properly. He said, I speak this by permission, not of commandment. For I would all men were even as I myself, but every man have his proper gift of God, every one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them to abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than burn. Intimacy is necessary in a marriage, but you cannot be intimate with a selfish person. When a person realizes that all I am is yours, and all that you are is mine, then you really have what a covenant is. because that's truly the nature of a covenant. And so when you have a covenant, you have to have a couple things. You have to have a seal of that covenant, and you've got to have a sign of that covenant. And if you've ever heard anyone say the marriage was not consummated, you can get an annulment instead of a divorce if a marriage is not consummated. Because it's recognized that if the act of intimacy has not occurred, then the marriage is not sealed, it's not closed. And I want you to think about something, just one of those things to really contemplate. The nature of a female is that the first time she has intimacy, she has a hymen. That hymen has to be broken and blood has to be shed. And that is always the seal of covenant, taking you right back to Jesus. And believe it or not, the word hymns, where we get psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, that's where that comes from. And so it is important to God for us to understand, because even our young people, they don't really realize how important it is to protect their purity, to protect they just don't get it. They don't even recognize that when the world tries to purport the idea that it is just a physical act, no, you are giving away covenant to every single person. And then people wonder why they're struggling. The devil did not create sex. He just did not do it. But just as the devil does with anything, he tries to pervert everything he gets his hands on. And so what Paul is telling us by this expression of intimacy and covenant between a husband and a wife, he's saying this is a license for use, not a license for abuse. And if you treat her body as if it was yours, and she treats your body as if it was hers, then you begin to understand the intimacy that begins to develop, because you'll respect her body as you respect your own. Do you see that? Number 4. Number 4. Let me take it a different direction for a second, because I think this needs to be said. I was going to skip it for the sake of time, but I'm just going to go there. Women have the gift of sex, and men have a need for sex. And so I want you to recognize that, because if a man's on a cycle of every 20 minutes, you keep thinking, well, he wants sex. He does not want sex. He needs sex. My car has 12 cylinders in it. It don't want gas. It needs gas. Okay? Trust me. Pass everything but a gas station. So what we have to recognize is that women have the gift of sex. Men have a need for sex. Now, men, pay attention. Men have the gift of affection. Women don't want affection. They need affection. And so as a man, when you respond in a way that helps them to understand you have connected with them affectionately, then they will respond sexually. This is God's way to make sure that jerks don't get laid. It's just that simple. Because if he's a jerk, she's not going to respond to that. And so many times people, I'm telling you, did I tell you this came out of counseling? I cannot tell you how many times husbands are sitting there not figuring out why their wife has closed off. And they're like, well, she's frigid and she's this and she's that. No, you, sir, are a jerk. And that's why she's not into you. So we have to recognize these things and deal with it in ways that help us to discern we are not the same. A woman rarely responds to sex beyond the state of her emotions. Rarely. God created a system for us to understand that, because we have to, as the church, we got to quit answering questions that nobody's asking. And we've got to start dealing with the things that are absolutely imperative. Does that make sense? Okay, so number 4. Be as creative as you want. Be as creative as you want. The Bible says marriage is honorable and all, and the bed undefiled. In other words, it says the word bed is coitus, which means sex or intimacy, is undefiled in the context of marriage. I've had people sit on my couch and ask me about sex toys and oral and anal and this, that, and fantasies and role-playing and all kinds of things. I mean, you would be shocked, the type of questions that I've had. And the reality is this. If you study through the Bible, you'll find that God puts very few limitations on what you can do in the context of a marriage. And he calls it all undefiled. So the reality is, if you want to swing from the chandeliers, help yourself. Just make sure that there's only one woman and one man in the context of covenant marriage. Are you here? And ask yourself certain questions. Does this violate my conscience towards God? Is this violating my spouse? Is it safe? Everybody got to live through it, right? When it's over, everybody's got to have a pulse. Everybody's still got to be alive. Now, whatever you can put together to get to that place, is this going to, damage the relationship? You got to be careful about certain things, but the reality is, whatever works for you and her, help yourself. There used to be a movement, you guys probably remember, the shepherding movement, where they went into people's home. They were telling you what positions you could do in your bed. The devil is a lie. That is just not the church's business. It just ain't. I am just not that interested. Y'all do whatever you want to do. Like I said, as long as you live through it, I'm good. But again, because the church has gotten so ridiculous, they've allowed themselves to miss the points that we have to have. Amen? All right, I've got a few more, but I think we've hit 45 minutes, so we'll go ahead and take a break, and then we'll pick up right where we left off.